Hi, I'm Pam Luer, and I'm on the board of the Friends of the Arts from the Hopkins Center for the Arts. We're here today at the Hopkins Center for the Arts for Emilie Bouvier's show called Held Within. I'm stepping in for Jim Clark, who is the visual arts manager. If you don't know, Jim is the man behind the curtain at the state fair. So while he's sweating his tail off at the fair today, we are cooling our heels here at the gallery. I almost need a jacket. Hi, Jim. Emilie's current show will be here until September 7th. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks for having such a beautiful show.
Absolutely.
And sharing your work with the community. It's really a treat. We talked a little bit about questions, and one of the questions that you felt was a good fit would be the question every artist gets asked is, what is the inspiration for your show?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the inspiration for this current show, this series of work called Held Within, is kind of twofold. One, for me, when I spend time doing my art making, I'm wandering in the woods with my cameras or making prints in the dark room or sitting at the wheel. It's a very reflective, kind of meditative process, and really kind of get into that time where I can just spend the time in reflection and contemplation. And really there's so much that we carry. I feel like I'm almost able to kind of catch up with myself and seeing the images as they come out through the developer, spending time on the trail and just listening and feeling the trees around me. It just is that time where I can kind of tend my inner work, if you will, and reflect on my own stories, the stories of the land where I am, the kind of beauty, the brokenness, all that stuff that we hold and carry. And also the same kind of phrase, held within, literally echoes the process of making photographs. So holding the light inside of a chamber or object or camera and tracing that light and shadows to create and record these images. So it kind of also reflects the process itself, and that process really drives and motivates my creative work. So it kind of holds those things together, both.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I wondered, I love that, held within. One of the things that when I walked through the show the first time, I noticed this milky, beautiful connection to each piece. And also the different ways that the installation works together with photography and textile and ceramic. Can you speak to that, kind of how they support each other?
Yeah, the very material nature of photography in using historic and alternative processes kind of lends itself to that sculptural exploration and also installation and kind of surrounding that I was really working to build into this exhibition and this space. The feeling of walking through the trees and catching these glimpses that are there but sometimes incomplete and kind of leave space for imagination, for reflection and wondering, and being surprised, which happens to me throughout the whole process of the image making, and is a part of that process I wanted to invite the viewer to step into in exploring these pieces and exhibits. So these are actually paper with encaustic medium and layered gold ink on them. So the encaustic kind of further gives more transparency to the already thin paper, so you can kind of see and walk around. They kind of have that translucent and ephemeral kind of feel to them that echoes very much that film and kind of catching a glimpse of what's there, but it's negative, it's transparent, you're kind of squinting through to see what's there or what's not, or looking through the lens. This is my medium format camera that I shoot. Everything that's traditional film-based in this series was made with this camera. But you're looking down and kind of literally peering into this like very fancy box with mirrors and light and shadow inside of it, and catching these kind of glimpses and glimmers of what's happening, which I find just absolutely beautiful and captivating, that draws me into that process of making the images. And so kind of surrounding people with that feeling through these bigger banner installation pieces, and the pinhole light study that kind of gets at the aperture or the pinhole, which is how several of the other pieces were made, to kind of explore that light and shadow and kind of get inside it in the way that I feel like the process really lends itself to.
You might have to go back and tell us what pinhole cameras is
Yeah.
and how you started that. And so
Yeah.
you're not using a digital camera and kind of really contemporary slick versions of photography. I mean, you went back in time. And how did you start in using pinhole cameras, and what was your first vessel that you used?
Yeah, I often, when people ask me like, what's your art medium? I say photography, but not what you think of when you think of photography, because it feels very different than what we've come to kind of know and understand photography to be. And I love and have been really drawn to the process of, almost feels like painting with light, and capturing and cradling that light and shadow, and holding the patterns that are made through photographic images in a like very literal and much more physical and material kind of way. And I got really interested in this in my undergraduate study. You do the traditional like make a room into a camera obscura, and holding up these pieces of paper in there and catch it. You're literally catching that light and shadow and playing with it in different ways. And so I've always been like trying to push that kind of edge of what constitutes an image and how do you make and trace a photographic image. So I first started playing with liquid light, liquid emulsion, the stuff that's in film basically, that is at its most basic sense, silver gelatin with silver halide crystals in it, which is the same stuff that's in film. It's the same stuff that's in darkroom paper. So if you see that on the labels, that just means like that's what made this image in this print, is the silver gelatin in the darkroom process. And so there's an element of that in all of these pieces, except for only the sculptures. But that's what actually makes and records the light. And so I've been working with a liquid emulsion on glass plates, actually kind of mimicking a collodion process of historic process photography. And my first pinhole camera series was using hollow eggshells and transforming these tiny eggshells into pinhole cameras. And I did a whole body of work around that, exploring fragility of the landscape and this particular place that had just gone through a forest fire. So I was showing this like snow and ash through this black and white photography and eggshells that really lent itself to that process. And so this kind of became an iteration of that, where then now I'm throwing these ceramic vessels that still actually have a little bit of that shape and form of the egg kind of echoed as a part of them, and then coating them with that liquid film, the silver crystals, and covering that off to light. Then that vessel actually becomes the camera. So it's, you can make anything into a camera. It works the same way as the human eye. If you have a hollow chamber that you close off to light with just a pinhole opening, then whatever's happening outside the object, camera, shoebox, or ceramic vessel starts to happen on the inside, upside down and backwards. In our eyes, it's rods and cones that send those electrical signals to our brain, and that's how we see. With a digital camera, it's a sensor that translates that light and shadow into information, into data that the computer is able to then project. And here it's the silver halide crystals that change configuration as the light hits, and that's what records that image. So then I take it back into the darkroom and put it through all of the chemistry process to then have this negative. This was one that didn't work that I brought just to show y'all, that traces on the inside of the piece. So then there actually is a digital element of the process where I'm using a digital photograph to capture this sculptural negative into a two-dimensional black and white image using digital photography and technology. And in the darkroom, you would take a negative and project light through it, and that's what creates the inversion onto the photo paper. And with these, then I'm using the digital tools in the grid of pixel information of light to reverse or invert that data to get the positive image. So you see them all displayed as pairs, the negative and the positive, to see, kind of see both. You get the abstract in the negative and the sense of the object, and then you get the positive image as its pair.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot about the process. And I'll just add also, as I'm talking about the pinhole cameras and the different kinds of cameras that I'm using, then this is my traditional oatmeal canister camera that I use to create those panoramic pinhole cameras that you see in the series on this side of the gallery. Were all made using this kind of camera. So with these, I'm using a paper negative, where it's basically the same kind of paper you'd print on in the darkroom, and exposing that negative that just, this is, again, a test one of the side of my house that goes inside the canister and then records this onto the paper. And then I'm scanning and doing an pigment print from these for the final piece. So again, I kind of like that conversation and back and forth of using those, different kinds of historic processes, much more like material oriented and kind of wonky ways of recording the images, and then using those digital tools to be able to pull out and make them more accessible prints.
So how long do you, if you're taking your vessel out to photograph in pinhole, how long is the exposure? I mean, do you have to set it somewhere very still and just walk away? Or I'm just curious, because everything about the process sounds very labor intensive and time sensitive. And I'm just curious how long some of these stages take. And that's part of probably the meditative piece of, making your work.
Yeah, because pinholes are very small apertures. They are a much longer exposure time. So I have them set up on a tripod, and the exposure time varies depending on how much light there is. So I think the shortest of these all are probably a couple minutes or handful of seconds. To the longest, this last panoramic pinhole camera on this side, I did at dusk, and it was a little over 30 minutes exposure. And I'm, I sometimes walk a little bit away, but never too far, because I want to make sure nothing happens. But it's very much like I, became you have to be very patient. Yeah. And that's part of that process too, being willing to just sit. And in some ways it forces me to sit still and observe new things and really listen. Literally, I've learned so much about bird calls and the birds in the area where I'm shooting just by virtue of needing to sit still and listen. And just also like really sitting with, what am I noticing? What am I thinking about? What am I learning about this landscape as I'm here? And I kind of love that the process forces me to do that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, that's kind of one of the beauties. Not only, in the process that you do your work is, but when you just walk through the show, it does have, I find it to be very peaceful, and you don't rush through this show. You just take your time, and each piece takes you to the next piece, and it feels like capturing light in ways that took time. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that it kind of forces you to slow down to make sense of what you're looking at when you have the negative and positive together also, and trying to look at and think about what am I looking at with the negative, or even when it comes into the positive, what's happening over here that kind of invites you to, explore and need to take that pause and maybe think differently about the shapes that you're seeing and what they mean.
So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like pottery, the pottery, or the photography? I mean, it's such a nice marriage. I'm just curious how they bumped up next to each other in your process.
Yeah, photography is the longest medium for me, working with that as my primary medium. At a pretty young age, I picked up, my first camera was a 35 millimeter film camera, and I picked it up, and having to do that manual focus, it was like, just from that second one, I was hooked. And then shooting a roll of film and bringing it to be developed and waiting the agonizing, 2 to 5 business days or whatever it was at the time, and like coming back and getting the, packet of film that sometimes usually represented like weeks of photographs, because you're very, it forces you also to be very judicious about what you click that, shutter button for, and then laying it all out and kind of, I loved every part of that process. So that, from the very early times of my creative world, was deeply connected to photography. Doing pottery kind of came about when, I guess, through school. My first class was in high school. I studied pottery as a part of my art study in undergrad. And I like pottery. It's very meditative and rhythmic also. Kind of get drawn back to those processes. And for me, it was mostly just functional pottery, like, making things for everyday use, which I also love because, you're interacting with something that was made with your hands and then goes literally into the hands of yourself or others to be used as a part of beauty that's everyday life. And so that always was really lovely to me. But this is kind of the first crossover into more from functional pottery into ceramic arts and sculpture. And so these vessels, I was just exploring with that kind of egg form in a different way, and really loved that kind of exploring that form and that shape, with the idea of creating them to be these cameras and sculptural objects. I had this idea, many years ago, and wasn't quite good enough with my technical ability to pull it off, and so it kind of was filed back there for a while before I felt ready to hey, you know what, I'm going to return to this, and it just kind of happened to be a good piece to play with and run with. But you can see some of the sculptures that go with this exhibition include and show different parts of that process. So as I've kind of sliced off this front part of the vessel to be able to show the negative on the inside, the other components became a part of a sculpture of fragments. Literally, that's what the title is, but that is, they're the fragments of these pieces. And then the installation that are all kind of on the floor, these whole vessels, that you get a sense of the entire object, and having them on the floor in different sizes, and some of them that have not silver gelatin, but a mirror paint on the inside that kind of show that reflection, makes you stop and go, hey, what's happening? And my hope is that folks kind of peer inside, what's going on in there, kind of get the sense of these tiny, beautiful, fragile little vessels that became the vessels for light and shadow and these images that that trace the world around us.
Wonderful. That's really, I wondered about the installation on the floor. If you haven't been back there, there's a group of the vessels on the floor. Mm-hmm. And at the opening, people were walking around and I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to get broken.
Yeah.
Get back, everybody.
Yeah.
So, but then everyone was very respectful and they just kind of, there was a lot of peering in and
yeah.
And so how do you hope people interact with your show? One of the things that you mentioned was you made this show for this space.
Yeah.
So you were very specific to the installation and the space ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just kind of curious how you hoped or would envision people walking through it and what they would come away with.
Yeah. Well, I kind of mentioned that just experience of wanting to invite folks into that contemplative mm-hmm. and reflective kind of space and explore and interact with the pieces differently. That is very much a part of how I was thinking about setting up the space and where things are. That installation on the floor is opposite this wall, and wanted that to be kind of a surprise. Like you come around the corner and you get a sense of the space and these tiny things, like what's happening here, and just feeling that invitation to go look closer, and that surprise, that curiosity, that invitation to get closer and think and wonder and explore. It's kind of that nugget of how I was setting this space up and hoping that folks will walk into it. And with these banner pieces too, you actually see them very differently from the front than from behind. From behind, the light shining through them, and you get this much more kind of ephemeral, illuminated sort of. It looks different. It's the other side of the film, and you can kind of see and wonder about the image differently. And on the front side is where that gold ink is. That I love it. I've been very excited watching folks come through and see them and take them in as a whole and go, oh, and then come closer and go, ooh, there's gold there, mm-hmm. and then follow that throughout. And that really was kind of. It's one of the rewarding moments where it's like, ooh, it's doing what I hoped it would. And inviting people to explore and reflect there.
Yeah, it does take you in for sure. And I just noticed the gold today by you describing it. So mm-hmm. thanks for that. One of the things that I noticed coming through the show the first time was how beautiful the framing. Mm. I know that's just a detail, but it's a really important detail, I think. Is there a story behind the frames?
There absolutely is. Yeah, the frames I actually build all myself. And that is a big part of the amount of work of this show also, because it's, a whole process in and of itself. When I was doing the Eggshell series and my other most recent work, I was living and working in Holden Village, a intentional community and retreat center in Washington State that's in the North Cascade Mountains and very remote, kind of its own space that is actually on Forest Service land. And so as I was creating work there as the village artist, I had this wood available that was actually for the village to use from trees that the Forest Service had selected and intentionally and strategically downed to protect the Forest Service road or other infrastructure. And so I had this gorgeous cedar wood from the forest where I was making images and learned frame building while I was living there, and absolutely loved it. Again, it's very material, right? And you're working with the elements that are in many ways a part of the photographs and a part of the process. And cedar wood also has a lot of surprise and a lot of character and a lot of luminosity. It seems to somehow capture the light in itself, which I'm fascinated by. It's just lovely. And so working with cedar wood is a part of working in that environment as an artist. And I was like, it's in some ways a very unconventional choice for framing because you often look for a harder wood that's going to be more durable. Cedar is much more fragile. But if you, I found this out because, you kind of nick things up sometimes when you're working with them. But if you put a cloth and a little bit of water and iron them, it bounces back really beautifully. So there's this kind of lovely fragility and resilience in the frame itself and that material. And it's a process of building those frames also slows me down and makes me, really pay attention and listen and work with a different kind of material in the process too.
Is there anything that you want to say about that particular series of branches right here? When you walk in the door, there's a series of 5 horizontal images that are kind of stacked on top of each other, but they're all so unique, and I just felt like there was a story behind that. Is there?
There is a story there. Yeah, we didn't talk about this, so yeah. Trees show up in like almost all of my work. I can't seem to get away from them. I just find myself really captivated by these like gestures of branches. Just seems to like hold on to something for me. And for one, I think there is a ton of wisdom and knowledge that trees carry. They have found amazingly tenacious and resilient ways of surviving and communicating with each other and holding and interacting with their environment. So I'm fascinated by trees, for one. But the way that their branches reach out, the way they stand, the way that they do interact with the space around them, just feels so like, it evokes so much. And I find that my own kind of stories and thoughts often, something about the way that a tree is posturing will invite me to think about that or reflect in that place. And this particular series that you notice, it's the same pair of trees, which you might not see right away. But the first image at the top of the series, you can see these 2 trees together. And I was in actually the park in my neighborhood where I had just kind of wandered there one morning with my breakfast and saw these trees, and the branches were meeting and they were rubbing against each other. And it was stripping all the bark off of these 2 branches at this one point. And I was just so struck and moved by these trees that were in this like relationship of some kind, this like space of tension, but connection, but like they were stuck, like literally hurting each other, but probably helping each other in other ways, I don't know. And it just made me sit there and think about these trees, and the way that the light was coming through that spot where the bark was removed was just the light shone right there, and I got this beautiful contrast, and the bright blue sky made this beautiful matte gray when it is in grayscale. And I took this picture just with my phone camera, kind of for my digital sketchbook, as I'm working, I'll do that. And so I came back, I was very excited to come back with my cameras and like, okay, I'm gonna make this picture. And I was using this, the oatmeal canister pinhole camera, and took the exposure. I was like, oh, you can't even see that X in the branches. It didn't work. I'll try again tomorrow. And so I was coming back. That sometimes I'll take the same photograph or the same place multiple times to try to get the right exposure things. And shocker, an oatmeal canister is not the same at all as a cell phone, the camera, and I was getting frustrated. I was like, this isn't working. I'm not getting quite the things that I really thought were so poignant about how that exposure turned out that first day. And I was like, I gotta try it again. I was coming back and again. And finally I was like, had them all laid out. I was like, oh, that's its own thing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be the exact thing on that first day. In fact, a relationship between trees or people or anything else is never going to be exactly the same as it was that one day and that one moment, and that's okay. And by coming back and sitting with these trees, I learned and saw different things about how they were connected and what that other day and that other time and place looked like. And so it kind of became a meditation on that space over time, rather than that one particular moment, and kind of, again, that process of returning and listening and reflecting, and being prompted to do that. And that particular pair of trees taught me that in a very real way through that series.
Which might answer both the next two questions. I was going to ask
Yeah.
you, what's the most challenging thing about being the artist that you are, and what's the most rewarding? It's like in that story, you almost...
Yeah, you kind of get
almost,
both.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I think, working with this very process-oriented medium, that's a lot of trial and error. I mean, with the, with any pinhole camera, you don't have a viewfinder. So you really don't know exactly what you're getting or how it's exactly going to look when you open it up. And that's, I think, actually both in a lot of ways. It's both the most frustrating because there's a lot of troubleshooting and things that don't work. And then there's also that just delight and surprise at what you find there that's unexpected. And it's often those moments that something turns out completely unexpected that are the most beautiful and the most meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you would like to share?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the piece right behind you also that was a similar one, and the negative for the sculpture is right on this other side. But that one I shot, and I had it in the dark room developing it, and I was like, oh, well, this didn't work. I overexposed it, and there are these weird bubbles in the emulsion. I was like, immediately was gonna just, throw it out, if you will. And then I did the quick, I'll use actually my phone before doing the final process to just take a quick sketch and do the inversion to see how it worked. And then it hit me, oh, these air bubbles that I thought were a mistake in the emulsion, actually became this constellation over the face of the image that seemed to actually give it more of this kind of abstract feeling of energy and vitality in this little chamber that wasn't at all anticipated, but became the thing that I most loved about this piece and how it turned out. So sometimes sitting with it too, you kind of come to something different or rediscover an image even that, wasn't intending it to go that way, but it totally surprised me. And even though I didn't love it at first, it's oh, actually, I really do like that, which is very cool.
No, you walk back in the room and you're like, oh, I was done. That's why I needed to just look at it from another perspective.
Yeah.
I'm also
exactly.
curious about the pinhole installation that you have over here, the light study. It feels very playful and unique to the space.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, that is just trying to get a little bit at that feeling and look of pinhole cameras and how the light moves through a pinhole and how things create patterns in capturing photographic images. And this one, once you know and kind of understand the camera obscura phenomenon, you kind of start to see that everywhere, I found. It was first discovered in caves, actually, how light came through a little opening, and you could see very faintly, what's happening outside on the back of the inside of the chamber. And when I was out on the trail one day, in an outhouse, there's the grate on the top of the outhouse that's kind of a set of pinhole cameras, and I suddenly realized, oh, this is a camera in here right now. And it's those little moments that suddenly, the least glamorous part of being out on the trail became this beautiful little magical camera moment, And so that's just kind of a hilarious ode to the camera in the outhouse that inspired a like immersive installation piece, that would not have been expected, but
this is why we love artists. They find beauty everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Do you think that this body of work, like how work kind of propels you into your next vision, or settle into a body of work for a while? Like, so will this continue kind of exploring in the same ways, or did anything kind of spark like, oh, well, now that I've done this, I have these other things on my list that kind of twirl around for a while? It's curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are some elements of this that I'll probably continue to explore. I really liked kind of working with ceramic in different ways of kind of playing with that object, camera, negative kind of piece. So I might keep exploring that some. There's a definite kind of idea that's unfinished with I think there are 3 included in this series that are using a transparent or translucent vellum, or actually it's glassine paper, that's very fragile and translucent, usually used for interleaving, not as like an actual surface. But I transformed that into a darkroom paper using silver gelatin, and then layer that with aluminum to create those images. And I love that process. I was hoping to do actually even a little bit more with that for this series, but it's very time intensive, like all of the other things in this body of work. So that's one that I know I'm going to pick up and be exploring that more and doing more with that series. My kind of dream that's, maybe a little further down the road, I want to do more with playing with glass. I have this dream to learn the medium of glass blowing, so I can do more with glass as a sculptural object, kind of in similar sorts of ways as I've been exploring with the ceramic. But because it's transparent, it gives you more that you can do with that. So that's a dreaming of combining mediums in what's maybe next for me in my art practice down the road.
Sounds perfect. It sounds like it's right there.
Yeah.
Are you up for some?
Just learning a whole new medium with a whole new studio.
Because you need that.
No small feat.
But what you do with it is going to be interesting, right?
Thank you.
You up for some questions?
Absolutely.
Does anybody have any questions?
Well, do you have a scientific background? Because it just sounds that way, like with all the experiment. I mean, you definitely have a lot of patience, but everything is like a process that I think a scientist would use. But you also have the creative part of it, which is great when you could put those things together.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have a particular science background actually, but I think that the part of what sciencey is just that curiosity and kind of wanting to learn and understand how something works, and then playing with that and kind of asking questions and then trying something out, and then once it fails, trying it again a different way. So that's very much a part of the process of this work. I do feel very mad sciencey when I'm liquefying. The silver gelatin is actually a jello at room temperature, so I'm scooping it out. It's a jello of silver halide crystals and gelatin, and liquefying that down in a double boiler in the dark room to coat the materials. So it does, feel very
It sounds very scientific.
Very scientific. But yeah, really just following my own kind of questions and curiosity has fueled the process. When I was learning the pinhole process with the eggshells, I would joke that, I ate a lot of omelets figuring it out, because I did. It's a lot of trial and error and a lot of patience, and that kind of troubleshooting and trying and failing and trying again is really, like we talked about, one of the most sometimes frustrating parts of the process, but also one of the most rewarding parts too when it clicks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A wonderful body of work, and as I look at you, I see a found object artist, because you're just finding these images out there, metallurgist because of all the metals you're working with, woodworker, it's like photography seems like it's almost a side gig for what you're doing.
Yeah.
Your results are quite fascinating. The resolution that you have on these tall pieces, what was that made of? Was that the pinhole or was that the medium format camera?
That was the medium format camera, yeah. Medium format gives you actually, because it's larger than 35 millimeter very significantly, it gives you a good amount of data in there. It's not like, crisp, but I kind of like how the film grain then, gives you a different, when you're pushing that image, that film grain feels very different than pixels in how it enlarges, which I really like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your intention of having people be surprised going around the corner, I almost fell over. Oh, oh my God, what fell and broke?
Yeah.
Quite lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, having them actually on the ground, I think further, I knew it's definitely having fragile pieces on the ground, you kind of know, like I'm willing to have them on the ground and risk them being broken because I want people to see and feel that, oh my gosh, they're fragile and they're right there and what's happening, it kind of takes you to a different place. So even knowing all of that, only one has broken so far. Knock on wood.
One of the ones here?
Yeah. So, but that's part of it being in the space and living in here, you know what I mean? So,
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
You should have a camera when people come around to do the reactions.
Yeah.
I think that's your next project, no?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, a photo trap of like.
Right. That's very funny.
Yeah.
Two related. I'm fascinated by the vessels, and I don't want to diverge from the artistic piece of this, but the technical piece. Could you say a little bit about how you get the silver in, and then also then the cutting open, and what that experience is like for you to see the negative for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually slice them open before making them into the camera. So when I'm throwing the vessels, I actually throw them and they're kind of attached to the wheel here, and so then I'm turning them and trimming the bottom. So it's kind of a two-part process for, like you would trim a cup or a plate or something like that, so it has a little foot, but here it's just finishing off the edge for the form. And then when it's leather hard is when I'm slicing and finishing that edge. So the clay actually can hold up. There's a little bit of water in there, so it's not brittle, but it lets you, that's kind of the water capacity of the clay, the point where you can kind of work with it is when it's leather hard. So I'm finishing it at that point, and then also prepping the other side. So some of the other side of the piece became those fragments that I incorporated into the other sculpture, and then some of them I was prepping to become then the other piece to receive a small plate for the pinhole. So you can kind of see that here you've got the two pieces that then I fire. They fire once and then I'm glazing them. So then I'm actually recovering it so that I get the glaze only on the outside, and dipping it in the glaze, firing it that second time to be the final ceramic piece that's then impervious to water in that second firing. And then that's when then I prepare it with the silver gelatin. So it's actually fairly open. It's not like I'm working all through the top hole and then breaking it, which is nice because then it gives me space to be working with and prepping that coat of the silver gelatin. And then adding this piece on top, because ceramic is actually, depending on how it is, but for these thin pieces, it's not entirely light tight. So that's why I'm closing it all the way off to light so that it can be an effective camera, because it needs to be that to create that exposure. So yeah, then the the pinhole is here on the front. It's closed off to light, exposed, brought back through, and then put through the chemistry washes. And it's magical developing it, especially for the negatives. Like if you're doing film, it's like, you've got it in the tub and or the canister, and it's that moment where it's all done finally at the end, and you pull it out and kind of holding it up, still dripping from the final wash to the light. For these, it's like you can see it coming up in the developer, like you would a paper, and so it's really fun. And it's kind of that balance of like, I want to see it, but I need to pay attention to my timing. And, is it getting too dark? Do I need to pull it out of the developer early, or do I, how's that going? So it's a moment that kind of is caught in that balance of the joy and surprise, and also like, I got to pay attention and make sure the process is happening right. So, yeah.
So you don't glaze on the inside?
No. And
could you? I mean, would it still work if you did, or if you did something else to the surface?
Yeah, you could definitely glaze it. I like leaving it the raw clay. But yeah, the emulsion, it interacts differently on different surfaces. So I like kind of the adhesion that I get from the raw clay more than the glaze acts a little bit more like glass. So it's a little finicky with how it moves on the surface, because it is literally just an emulsion on the surface of the material. So, yeah.
I'm a potter too. Do you use porcelain? Is that or what kind of clay have you been using?
This is a bee clay body.
Oh, okay.
So it's a little bit, it's kind of porcelain-esque in that it's a lighter bodied clay,
Right.
but it's not quite as refined as porcelain.
Right.
And what I love about bee clay is the way that it interacts with the glazes and the firing. You can see, you get like a little bit of this flashing.
Right.
The orange flashing, which I like how that kind of bumps that line here and gives it a little bit of depth
that's
and
a high
character.
fire, correct?
Yeah,
Yes,
cone
okay.
10 fire. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Cone 10.
Yeah.
Okay.
Obviously, you can do composition when you're creating the physical objects. How do you approach composition for, you're setting this thing down, it's got a pinhole in there. You can predict, I'm sure you have some skill in determining what's going to be in there. But how do you approach composition as you're doing those works?
Yeah, especially with pinhole cameras, because you get such a wide angle because the image goes so far around the sides. For those, I've become very, very used to scanning much further outside the frame than I would normally be looking with a traditional film camera. So it's kind of pushed where I look and the different things that I think about. Like if there's a really bright spot over here, I might go, ooh, that could be a problem with how that would show up on this part. So I've gotten pretty used to like what that feedback loop looks like for what shows up or doesn't. It's very difficult to point and aim, but you can kind of have some pretty informed guesswork.
Right.
So the very first one of these that I did, I forgot that it's upside down, and I exposed it this way instead of this way, and it was like, oh no. Thankfully, I realized it as I was making the exposure, and I had a second one with me that I could do, but yeah, it's a lot of hit and miss and learning kind of what to look for along the way.
How many times do you typically try to capture the same scene, and maybe you can't even know if you have something to correct unless you come back later after you've exposed whatever happened?
Yeah. It kind of varies. Some of them, especially with these, I would do the same. The second to last of the 5 large panos, I think I did that one 4 or 5 times. So I really liked that scene, and then that gave me choices. And it was very difficult between 2 of them actually to decide even, but that one in particular I shot several times. Many of the others were once. Some of them didn't work and I decided not to come back, but there are some times where it's like, ooh, almost, but I'm gonna try this one, try it again, or try it on an overcast day, or try it on a sunnier day, So the light, and especially the time of day and the way that, sunshine or clouds really, really, really impact the composition too. So there are times where I try that different ways. Yeah.
So even though you shared a lot of your trade secrets, I pretty much can guarantee that no one's going to try this at home. I'm one.
Yeah.
So no, you don't have to worry about that. Yeah.
Get very familiar with how electrical tape moves and things that you never thought you would have have to worry about. Yeah.
I think the difference between scientists and artists is scientists take notes so that somebody else can do exactly the same thing. And artists take notes to make sure they never do exactly the same thing again.
Yeah. Oh, you haven't seen my notebooks, though. Yeah.
Then you have to find the notes. No.
Exactly. Going forward, where would we find some of your future work? Do you have a website or some social media that we should pay attention to?
I do, yeah. You can find my work on my website, emiliebouvier.com, my first and last name. As you probably noticed with this body of work, there's a lot of things that are created only in the darkroom that don't actually have a final digital piece. So it will be up to date, hopefully sooner than later, with this body of work. But it lives here in person right now and will live on my website in perpetuity coming soon. But there you can find my work. I also have an Instagram account that's a lot of kind of snippets of behind the scenes and process and just things that I'm working on. So you can catch glimpses of the kind of making and process there. The handle is @EmilieBouvier_arts. And so we'll, I'm sure, be able to link these also in the video section as well. So
definitely
keep an eye out for those.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It was terrific. I'm at the Hopkins Center for the Arts with Emilie Bouvier. Her show Held Within will be at the center until September 7th. Yeah.